someone released a clip of me talking about some of the things we just talked about. And it went out on YouTube Shorts, and it's got like 5 million views in a month or something like that. And the comment section is unbelievably vitriolic. Every single comment is vitriolic, and it's all from women. It's like, who is this old white bastard telling us what we should do with our bodies?
You see the ONS data that came out a couple of weeks ago that said for the first time ever since records began, 50.1% of women are childless by 30. So there are more women without children at 30 than there are women with children. The first time ever.
Well, somebody clipped a part of one of my podcasts, I believe it was, where I was talking about what our society does to 19-year-old women, or 18-year-old women, 19-year-old women. We just lie to them all the time. The first lie is, there's nothing more important than your career, more or less by definition. So that's the first lie. The second lie is, there will be nothing more important to you in your life than your career. So that's the second lie. And then the third lie is, there should be nothing more important in your life than your career. So that's the third lie. And then implicit in that is the idea that children are a burden, and that the idea that women should have children is part of the oppressive patriarchy and should be resisted. And who are men to tell me what I can do with my body? And hey, fair enough, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've worked in female-dominated occupations my entire life. For example, I worked as a daycare worker way back when, that was like 1980, something like that. And there were no men doing that, but I really liked kids, and so that was fun. And I worked for social services in Alberta in the childcare department, and then I've been working as a psychologist, either training or as a psychologist since then, and that's been a female-dominated enterprise increasingly as the years went by. But even when I first entered it, so I'm in the post-female in the workplace generation firmly. I never experienced the world except as that, and so I've watched women progress through their professional careers at every level of attainment, from the lowest to the highest, and observed what happened, and relatively, I would say, bias-free, because I didn't know. And what I've seen is that as women progress towards their late 20s, there's a psychological transformation, and what happens is that they place less emphasis on their career and way more emphasis, particularly on having a child. And that really reaches a crisis point around 29 or 30 for the vast majority of women, and their attitude flips. And I've seen it flip very dramatically with many women. And I suppose the most convincing evidence of that, I worked with high-end lawyers in Toronto for about 10 years. I was part of an organization. We went to law firms, high-end law firms, and said, send us your most productive people, and we'll help them iron out whatever wrinkles there might still be in their life. And the advantage to them is that things will go better for them, and the advantage to you is they'll be even more productive. And there's a good management dictum, which is pay the most attention to your most productive people, because they're bringing in the bulk of your revenue disproportionately. And so I worked with men and women who were at the peak of their careers in a very difficult enterprise. And so these were women who were generally very attractive, well put together physically, pretty stable psychologically, extremely conscientious, very, very smart, and high achieving from like junior high all the way through high school, university, law school, onto the top firms, rocketing up through the ranks, full partnership by the time they were 29 or 30. And all the law firms, all the women bailed out, all of them. The law firms couldn't keep them. And I was really, and I talked to the women a lot about this, because I was very interested in it, because I knew the law firms were bending themselves over backwards and tying themselves into knots trying to retain these women, because why wouldn't they? Just being greedy capitalists is enough. They don't want to lose their high-performing women because they're performing at the highest level, and they couldn't keep them. The women wanted to have 9-to-5 jobs. They wanted to bind the job so they could have a life, and that was especially true once they got interested in having a child or had one. And what they really came to was a very interesting realization. So because they were highly conscientious women, they sort of did their duty and worked hard and diligently and didn't pop their head up to ask questions. They were in junior high, they got the best grades. They were in high school, they got the best grades, and so on, all the way through, right till they reached partnership. But that's sort of an apogee, right? You hit partnership in a senior law firm, it's like you're at the top of your profession. Well, then what? Well, so then they looked around and they thought, here I am with all these like hyper-competitive men, perfectly willing to work 80 hours a week, nonstop, to stay at the top. What the hell are they doing? Because that's the real question. What is it that characterizes this small percentage of hyper-competitive men? It's not. You can assume that that's how everyone should be, but first of all, that isn't how everyone is. Or you can flip that and say, well, there's only a small minority of human beings that are willing to do this, to work flat out 8 hours a week. I mean, they're certainly being paid for it. Let's make no mistake about that. But well, what about the rest of life? Well, that's what the women asked. Why am I doing this? And that's a great question. Well, for men, there's a different answer than for women. It's a really different answer. And it isn't like the men are exactly thinking this through. It's more like this is an integral part of male motivation. The more successful you are as a man, the more women like you. I released a video. I was going to conclude that other story. I released a video, or someone released a clip of me talking about some of the things we just talked about. And it went out on YouTube Shorts, and it's got like 5 million views in a month or something like that. And the comment section is unbelievably vitriolic. Every single comment is vitriolic, and it's all from women. It's like, who is this old white bastard telling us what we should do with our bodies? And I wasn't being judgmental. I was just saying exactly what I said to you, which is, well, I've watched women over the entire course of my life with, I would say, an affectionate eye. I love my sister, I love my wife, I have a daughter, I love my mother. I'm pretty happy about women, all things considered. I don't have an axe to grind in relationship to how they should conduct their lives. I don't even know how they should conduct their lives. I've watched what happens. And I've also watched what happens to women who hit 29 or 30 and then can't conceive. And that is not a fate I would wish on anyone. It's awful. And 30% of couples fall into that. 30% of couples have difficulty conceiving. It's a lot. And the probability that you'll have difficulty conceiving increases with age. And so, c'est la vie. But it's very interesting to me to see how vitriolic those comments have been and how uniform that is, because usually on my YouTube channel in particular, 95% of the comments are positive. And this is completely the opposite of that. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? Men work longer hours. They work more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to move. They're more likely to work outside. They're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable. They make more money for those reasons. And that's all hidden under the idea that the reason...
What do you understand by equality, Sophie? What does it mean to you?
Freedom.
Can you be more... Is it equality of opportunity? Is it equal pay across the board? Is it something more than that?
I think equality is better for everyone. I think,
okay.
And I'm really delighted, I love my job because it's an optimistic and a hopeful job, which is about creating more choices for people. I'm interested in people being able to have different choices and having equality of outcome.
Aha, well, so you're going to have choices and equality of outcome. What if people choose different things, which is what they've been doing in Scandinavia? So the Scandinavian countries have moved more towards gender equality than any other countries, and the personality differences in Scandinavia have increased rather than decreased, and the proportion of women who are choosing STEM fields has decreased rather than increased. So as cultures become more gender neutral, the number of women who choose STEM fields decreases.
What do you mean by
increasing.
STEM fields?
So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
I
So if you let men and women make their choices, what actually happens is that they specialize in different situations, and you don't get equality of outcome.
Could they not have been programmed to have those views from the moment we raise them and give boys
No.
Lego and construction?
No,
girls?
because what happens is that as countries get more egalitarian, which means there's less programming of that sort, the differences get larger, not smaller. And the scientific data on that is clear, and most of it was generated by people who have a left-leaning bias, so you can't blame it on conservative scientists. It was a shock to everyone to find that out.
Sophie,
I think the difference between Jordan and me is that we look at evidence and we lean towards different theories. So Jordan's theory is very much evolutionary, that there are inherent differences in men and women. Mine is very much more social role theory, if you like, and that men and women are taking on different roles due to the expectations that society puts on them. And it's interesting that Jordan frequently cites Scandinavian countries where they've made more, like there's nowhere in the world that women are equal, but Scandinavia has made the most progress towards shared parenting, etc.
Yep.
That said, it's not done yet. There's nowhere in the world where this is done yet.
But it's having the opposite effect that the gender equality types predicted. Opposite, not the same. And it isn't a theory, it's actually data driven by tens of thousands of surveys and the best scientific literature on the topic. It's not a theory, and I didn't come about it because of my political perspective. I looked at the data. What it showed was that as countries become more egalitarian, the differences between men and women grow, they don't shrink.
So what I'm interested in is data and analysis as well, and I'm particularly interested in the ones presented, such as the ones by the University of Southern California, which discovered that change towards gender equality is actually being slowed by beliefs that are legitimizing social inequalities on the basis of sex. And I'm also interested, like Jordan, I look at the data and I look at the studies, and I'm really also very much interested in studies like the analysis that was done by the American Psychological Society, which looked at 45 analysis of whether there's sex difference over 20 years. And its conclusion was that men and women are basically alike in terms of personality, in terms of cognitive ability, in terms of leadership. But what it did find was that media depictions of men and women as fundamentally different perpetuate misconceptions, as does workplace bias.
Oh God, so it's my fault.
So, no, well, you're leaving soon. It's okay.
Men and women actually are more the same than they are different. But the issue is that small differences at the population level can turn into very large differences at the extreme. So, for example, men and women are broadly similar with regards to aggression, although men tilt a little bit more towards aggression. So that if you picked a random person out of the population, male and female, and you guessed that the male was more aggressive, you'd be right 60% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, they're all male. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that, just out of curiosity? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? And men work longer hours, they work more dangerous jobs, they're more likely to move, they're more likely to work outside, they're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable, they make more money for those reasons, and that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. It's a very simplistic analysis, and trying to
Michael,
address
I was just going to say, Sophie, can you come back on that?
What I'm trying to equalise is opportunity and choice.
Fine, let's
And I-
equalise
and I-
choice.
You agree
Absolutely.
on that.
But we won't get equal outcome that way.
And I think that what happens then, nobody knows, because we've never done it yet.
We do know.
But
We
I
know
think
what's happened in
it
Scandinavia.
But it's not
Scandinavia's
fully
not
got there yet.
finished
No, but it's going in the opposite direction that everyone predicted, and strongly.
I think one of the things I loved about Jordan's book, which I speed read last night, so forgive me, Jordan, I've not read every line. But one of my favourite rules in Jordan's book is Rule 9, which says, assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't. And I think that in a country where men outnumber women by 2 to 1 in Parliament, in local government, where women's voices are not equally represented in media, where our education systems still are teaching boys and girls ideas of pink and blue. What I'm trying to do is work with thousands of optimistic, hopeful people for change.
Your boss called the gender pay gap a burning injustice, is it?
Yes, it is, because there should be inequality of opportunity. there needs to be the same rights. But you know, something that surprised
outcome,
me,
quality of
that
outcome.
neither of you, and the quality of outcome, sure, all of that. But the one thing both of you haven't mentioned is the biological difference, which unfortunately affects women's career prospects, whether we like
Babies
it or not.
and so on, yeah.
Babies. And that does cause a problem. You know, if I were to take a sabbatical from a corporation for a while, it's going to set me back slightly. And it is a problem that biologically it's women who have babies, not men.
Sure, but that's why we are the Women's Equality Party is the only party in the UK that's got policies around shared parental leave.
She's so political.
We're the only party that has got fully costed plans for universal free childcare. One of the other things we want to do is to have a look at curriculums, to have more female role models, to encourage girls, because so long as we still see STEM as a boys' area that we're trying to get girls into, it's not going to work. We need to do the work we're doing on care, get more boys thinking about, nursing, teaching, more role models for boys in schools.
And
that's the way you break it all
on
down.
programs like EastEnders, The Archers, that's helped them a lot.
Right, so listen, I have to draw things to a conclusion. Can I just say how wonderful, 3 people, diverse political views, diverse views on many other issues, that get along famously and have wonderful conversations. Thank you.
There's only 2 reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years.
Why do you think so many young men are following you? Because you have a lot of your audience.
Because I want
are
the
young
best for them, genuinely.
men.
I'm encouraging them.
More than you do for young women?
No, not
So
not
why
in the
do you
least.
think so many are young men?
Oh, well, I think part of it's technological fluke. I mean, I came to prominence, at least in part, on YouTube, because I put my university lectures there, and it happens to be the case that 80% of the people who watch YouTube are young men. So there's that, and it's hard to know how to factor that in exactly. But then I think that young women are encouraged a lot, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. But I think that that's less true for young men now, because we believe that there's something pernicious about male competence and activity. It's part of I suppose it's part of the notion that the best way to characterize Western society is as a tyrannical patriarchy, which is a appalling doctrine as far as I'm concerned.
How come is that?
Well, it's not a tyrannical patriarchy. So it's not tyrannical, that's the first thing. Certainly not compared to any other governmental form that currently exists and has ever existed.
What you're doing and doing now as well is challenging the idea of gender equality. Why do you think that can be a problem, the idea of gender equality?
I don't think that equality of opportunity is a problem. I think that's a great thing, and that anyone with any sense champions equality of opportunity. I mean, even if you're purely selfish, say, and purely self-centered, you'd want to set up an economy where everyone who had ability could be maximally exploited by everyone else, because then we can all benefit from each other's talents. And so equality of opportunity is an absolutely useful fundamental principle.
So where's
but
the
that has
problem?
nothing to do with equality of outcome. Those things aren't even in the same conceptual universe. And to strive for equality of outcome is, well, it's a fool's game and likely to be it has proved to be in the past, extraordinarily dangerous, as well as impossible. The biggest differences between men and women in the world in terms of temperament and interest are in Scandinavia, and they've maximized as a consequence of your egalitarian policies.
What do you mean by that?
It means that the more egalitarian your state, the bigger the personality differences between men and women. That's like
How do you measure that? How do you know that?
Oh, well, psychologists have perfected, at least to some degree, the measure of personality over the last 30 years with very advanced statistical models. And so what you do is you offer men and women well-validated tests of preference and of personality. And you do that all across the world with tens of thousands of people in multi-country samples. And then you look at the difference between men and women, and then you rank order that by wealth and egalitarian social policy. And what you find is the more egalitarian the society, the more different the men and women become.
Is this something you can recognize, or is it?
I would say, for me, it's quite a simple question, actually. Do we want that our sons and daughters should have the same opportunities and the same dreams or hopes for the good thing, or no? And for me, it's simple to answer that. It's yes, of course. So for me, equality and gender equality is very, very important. For me, also when we talk about gender equality, it's important for me to learn my daughter that her mom can lead and show the way, and her dad can hug and kiss her and show feelings. And I think that's something very important for the hoods where kids grow up, to show feelings, to have these gender equality discussions, to show her a way of opportunities and to strive forward. And it's important both for lonely men, lonely young men, but also for women that feel this roof of glass. They need to fight and to struggle the roof of glass to be successful in their lives.
Do you agree on this?
I think that equality of opportunity is a perfectly reasonable proposition. I mean, I have a daughter and a wife. I do everything and many female clients and who I've consulted with and helped, and in many cases helped accelerate the development of their career tremendously. It's obviously of great utility to encourage forward striving in young people and people in general. That's not the issue in the least. The issue is the outcome.
Well, then why do you think the outcome, and these countries where the outcome is more equal, why do you think that leads to bigger differences between the sexes?
Because there's only two reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. So, I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years. And it's been replicated in the last month 3 times in 3 separate samples, including in Science, which is the world's greatest scientific magazine by a large margin. And it isn't a small effect, it's a huge effect.
But excuse me, what does it mean? Does it mean that Scandinavian men and women are having more difficulties meeting each other, talking to each other, than other places?
No, not necessarily, but it does mean that there are reasons for differences in participation rates in different occupations that aren't a consequence of socialization. So, for example, this is especially true at the extremes. So, for example, on average, men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And that's actually the biggest difference we know of psychologically between men and women. And even though men and women are quite similar, all things considered, the extremes make a difference. So you imagine that in order to become an engineer, look, obviously not everyone becomes an engineer, you have to have a particular temperamental proclivity to become an engineer. You have to be extraordinarily interested in things rather than people. Well, most of those people are men. And if you want to become a nurse, well, then you have to be much more interested in people than you are in things. And most of those people are women. And so you get differences in occupational choice that are also, by the way, quite great in Scandinavia, especially in the case of engineering and nursing, that are mostly due to biological differences, and you cannot minimize that by social engineering. So, and it's not a bad thing. Like, look, one of the things you want to ask yourself is that what is the purpose of setting up a society that offers maximal equality of opportunity? And one of the answers is that you maximize people's free choice. And if you maximize free choice, then you also maximize differences in choice between people. And so you can't have both of those.
But of course it will have differences in choice, of course, because we are human beings. But I can't see why it differs between me and Skavlan, for instance. But of course it differs in biological things, but not in choices, because I think more how we raise them, how we live, education, a sort of culture, attitudes form a human being, whether or not they are a girl or a boy when they grow up. Mm-hmm. And if I raise my daughter to become a leader, to be self-confident, to have a high education, for instance, I think she will have a good platform to become a civil engineer, to become a CEO of a company, or to become a nurse. if
Well,
she wants
that is what people who think that the differences between people who are primarily culturally constructed believe, but it's not what the evidence suggests.
Okay, we don't agree on that.
One thing answer for everything.
You could let
it's like
me-
it's part of the patriarchal institution.
Unless it's true, right?
Look,
Women do
it's
more,
not
much
capitalism.
more.
Well, for God's sake, I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting.
Did you have different ambitions for your daughter and for your son?
Some of them were different. I encouraged my daughter in her desire to be a mother, which is not something I did with my son.
Did you encourage him in his desire to be a father?
Absolutely.
Right. So you encourage both of them to be a parent.
Right, but those are different.
Yeah.
So
I believe.
and yeah, I mean,
the case.
and in some sense, I think it's harder for young women because, of course, the problem of integrating family with career is a more complex problem for women to solve. So, and I spent a lot of time talking to her about how she might solve that. I wouldn't say that we came up with anything that was spectacularly original or successful, but I at least let her know that whatever pathway she chose was fine with me as long as she was being honest with herself about what it was that she wanted. But also that, I'm not a fan of the idea that the most fundamental orientation that a person is likely to have in their life is career. I don't believe that's true for most people. I certainly don't believe it's true for most women. And I think the evidence supports that claim quite straightforwardly. So,
However, it is the only thing that you get paid for under capitalism. Right?
man, live.
But that's
How can
true.
you say something like that?
Paid-
It's so cliched.
Well,
it's so painful to hear that.
It may be cliche, but it nonetheless is true, right?
Look,
Women do
it's
more,
not
much
capitalism.
more. Well,
For God's sake.
it is.
No, it isn't. You have to invest into a child for 18 years before they have any economic utility. It's a consequence of delayed economic utility. We don't know how to monetize it. It's not a consequence of capitalism. It's a consequence of the fact that human beings have an 18-year dependency. How do you monetize that, even in principle?
Well,
we don't know.
We did used to send them up chimneys, to be fair. And at that point,
Well,
what's
true.
really interesting is at that point, children were seen as being much more the property of the man. And as they become economically useless, all the legal studies show that that's when we start moving to a model of female custody, right? Because it was about caring labour. But this is the point I'm making. Is
A
that
model. Look, I'll tell you, there are plenty of men who are not very happy about the model of female custody. And that would,
Yes,
and
that
that
is
would
true.
include the, 85% of men who are essentially denied 50-50 custody when they divorce and have young children. So I wouldn't think that one of our major problems, or at least a major unidimensional problem, is the proclivity of men to foist off the custody of their children onto women. There's certainly another side of that argument.
There is, and I do think that actually a lot of anger has been generated by the way we have in Britain anyway, or England and Wales, we have an adversarial fault-based divorce system, and that's something that's changing. But what it does is encourage people to come in on day one and say, if you want to get divorced, you're going to have to make out a case that the other person has been a bastard.
It doesn't
to you.
matter, because if you move to a non-fault-based divorce system, then all that happens is the fault shifts to who should get custody.
You have a ridiculous situation where couples who say, well, actually, we've just grown apart, nonetheless, unless they want to wait 5 years or 2 years for separation, they have to go in and plead unreasonable behaviour to get a divorce and start splitting up their assets. That's the joy of no-fault divorce, is that you don't have to make those contested cases. You can simply say, our marriage is no longer working, and part ways without going into all of that acrimony. That seems quite sensible to me.
It also seems quite naive to me.
Well,
I've seen very few non-acrimonious divorces. They're very hard on kids. So I don't think anything that makes them easier is a very good idea, unless you don't think that marriage is a useful institution. And if you think that it's part of the patriarchal tyranny, then you might think that as well. So, but it's a very useful institution, mostly for kids.
I agree that I'm married. Modern marriage has a lot to recommend it. I do also think it is a patriarchal institution. It is literally...
Of course you think that,
Well,
because you think virtually everything that occurs in our society is a patriarchal institution. And it's easy to think that because then you only have to think one thing.
You could
have a one-thing answer for everything.
You could
it's
let
like
me-
It's part of the patriarchal institution.
I don't think
It's
you're
like-
obeying the rule that says maybe treat people as if they have something worth hearing. So
I'm not making a case for the patriarchal tyranny.
I'm gonna
and
make
I
it-
don't think you are either. I think that you're making a case that's like a universally cliched case for the patriarchal tyranny. I don't see too
Why
much
do
of
women
you
change
reflected
their
in your
names?
articles at all.
why do women change their names on marriage traditionally?
I don't know. exactly. Why do you think they do?
Because it was to symbolise the transfer of their ownership from one family to another family. That's why in The Handmaid's Tale you have off Warren,
Oh
off Glenn.
God, Margaret Atwood. Well, she was just about devoured by the feminists last year, so that was something interesting to observe.
I think she made a very good point. She wasn't devoured by all feminists. I'm a feminist. I thought what she said about due process in cases like that is perfectly reasonable.
Well, many people didn't.
No, but then, guess what? This is on the internet, you can find someone who disagrees with pretty much anything. But so why do you think women change their names when they get married traditionally? If it's not about transfer of property ownership traditionally?
I don't know if I have an opinion about that. The specific reasons for that, I'd have to look into it for a fair amount of time before I decided it, but I certainly wouldn't boil it down to a unidimensional argument about the ownership of women by men. So,
Okay.
I mean, the part of the problem too is with this sort of discussion is that it's, and this is why I consider it a manifestation of ideological possession. It's predictable.
Well, that's what
knowing your stance on.
But having a coherent ideology does mean that it is predictable, because
You don't need an ideology.
it is one logical thing that flows from another, and all those pieces tessellate together. So what I find very interesting about your thinking, I find it quite slightly baffling, is that I don't really see how all the pieces fit together. You say that you're not, you believe in God, but there's a lot of emphasis about
No,
going
actually
back to...
say I act as if God exists.
Right. But,
which is actually my definition of belief.
Okay, but that then doesn't, to me, tessellate very obviously with your insistence that actually it's just about pure science, and there's not a, because I can see...
What insistence that it's just about pure science?
Well,
I wrote Maps of Meaning. There's no insistence in that it's just about pure science.
Okay, but you
I
make
said
appeals
that
to
there were two
science.
very different.
You make appeals to science all the time. You say, well, this is what the literature says, and the trouble with God is that ultimately you can't say this is what the literature says. There is no literature.
Which is why I don't say anything about the scientific status of God, apart from what can be experienced maybe under certain conditions of what would you call chemical-induced mysticism, which seems to be something that you can say something scientifically about. But I see that there's two different realms, right? There's a realm of values and a realm of facts. And in the realm of facts, science reigns supreme. But it doesn't in the realm of values. You have to look elsewhere. That was what the humanities were for, before they got, what would you say, hijacked by ideologues. And the idea that something should be consistent. You were talking about the necessity for consistency in ideology. It's like, I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting, because I don't know anything about you. I could replace you with someone else who thinks the same way. And that means you're not here. That's what it means. It's not pleasant. So you're not integrating the specifics of your personal experience with what you've been taught to synthesize something that's genuine and surprising and engaging in a narrative sense as a consequence. And that's the pathology of ideological possession. It's not good.
You have to have signed consent before making any physical move. And then that's so what? Really? Who thought that up? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You know how awkward that would be?
First of all, thank you very much for being here and helping us to wake up. I really appreciate it. So my question is, as a redeemed progressive, what is the key to empowering men in the Me Too age while maintaining healthy boundaries and strong behavioural expectations?
We've had relatively reliable birth control since 1960. Okay, that's not very long. And we underestimate the unbelievable technological triumph of birth control. It's the hydrogen bomb, it's the transistor, it's a major league transformation in human interaction. Women are now free from involuntary reproduction. That's never been the case in the entire history of the planet. Okay, we don't know exactly what to do about that. Okay, so the first idea in the 60s was, hell, let's party. And you could see why. It's like what the rules for not engaging in promiscuous sexual intercourse seemed to have vanished. So we had a couple of decades of experimentation. It's like, well, how'd that go? Little hard on the family, I would say. That's not so good for kids. AIDS That wasn't a plus. Could have killed us all. And it mutated, particularly to take advantage of promiscuous sex, because viruses are very tricky things. So it turns out that sex is a little bit more complicated than we thought. Well, it actually turns out that it's a lot more complicated than we think. Okay, and now it's 50, 60 years later, and we're trying to sort this out. It's like, well, when is it okay to have sex? Exactly. And when is it not okay to have sex? And what does it mean that it's okay? And what does consent mean? And the answer to that is, well, we never used to have to think these things through, because the rule was don't have sex until you get married. That was the rule. Now that isn't the rule. Okay, so what's the rule? Well, we're not having a conversation about the rule. We're waiting till someone does something that seems like it might be untoward and then mobbing them and trying to extract the rule out that way. And it's not a very effective way of doing it. You know, you want to decrease campus rape? That's easy. Get rid of alcohol. No one has that conversation. It's like I did my PhD work on alcohol. 50% of the people who are murdered are drunk, and 50% of the people who kill them are drunk. And almost all the date rape situations are consequences of excess intoxication. But yet there's a party culture on campuses and anything goes. And you also have this strange thing, especially on the radical left, which is unbelievably paradoxical, where absolutely every form of sexual expression imaginable is 100% permissible because sex is fine, but it's so dangerous that while you're dancing with someone at a Princeton mixer, you have to ask them 2 or 3 times if it's okay for you to continue. And that's actually the case, by the way. I'm not making that up. It's like, well, both of those things can't be true. Now, what's happening, I think, on the Me Too end of things and the affirmative consent end of things is the old sexual taboos are reasserting themselves. The idea that we can extract sex out from emotional intimacy, and especially emotional intimacy, I would say, psychological intimacy, maybe even from long-term relationship, I don't believe it's a tenable idea. I don't think we can do it. And a lot of what we're seeing is the backlash against that. It's like, well, I feel used, because one of the things that's happening on the really radical end of the anti-sexual abuse movement is the idea that, well, if you have intercourse with someone and then you regret it the next day, that's evidence that it wasn't consensual. Well, it is, in a sense, evidence that it wasn't consensual, because it's evidence that you didn't bloody well think it through, right? It was good for last night, but it's not good for today. It's not very wise. The question is, well, what constitutes consent? And we need to have a very serious conversation about that. Like, under what circumstances is it acceptable to give consent? But we're not mature enough to have that conversation. We want it both ways. We want to be able to do whatever we want, with whoever we want, whenever we want, with no consequences, and we want there never to be any trouble about consent. It's like, well, no, that's not going to happen. I don't think that sex works very well outside of committed relationships. I don't think there's any evidence that it does. There's a strong proclivity across cultures for the enforcement, social enforcement of long-term monogamy. And there's reasons for that. And I think you deviate from that at your peril. So now, if you want to deviate from that, there's all sorts of reasons to do it. And I can understand why people are interested in adventure and all of that. But, my sense also as a clinician is, you only really get to try out about 5 people in your life. You have to make a decision pretty damn quick. Like between 20 and 30, there's a lot of things to get straight, and long-term mate is usually one of them. And most of the time, people should be more careful with their sexual behavior when they're young, especially when they're drunk, than they are. And I just think it's so interesting that all of the taboo reconstruction is coming from the radical left. It's not what you'd expect at all. You'd think it'd be the damn right-wing Christians complaining about, sexual immorality. It's like, no, it's the radical lefties. You have to have signed consent before making any physical move. And then that's so what? Really? Who thought that up? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You know how awkward that would be? You're supposed to be able to do a little bit of nonverbal reading, right? I mean, that's part of romance. You don't see it. You ever see a movie where the two people who are dating exchange consent notes? Like, that doesn't happen. So it's an unrealistic solution. But I think the real solution is that despite the fact that we have reliable birth control, we're going to have to relearn what the acceptable rules of propriety are with regards to sexual relationships. One of the things I often tell my young clients is, don't do anything physically with anyone that you wouldn't talk to them about. Because if you're too damn embarrassed to talk about it, well, maybe it's a little premature in the relationship to actually do it. And then there's harm in it. There's emotional harm in it on both parties. There's the cheapening of both parties. So it's going to take us a long time to sort this out. But hopefully we can do it in a serious manner, and it won't be merely a matter of mobbing those who seem to have made an error.
I don't believe that there is moral casual sex, because I don't think sex is casual. I don't think anything about it is casual. I don't think there's any such thing as a casual sexual relationship. I don't believe that. I've never seen any evidence that that's the case. I think that there are people rationalize that constantly because they want to believe that short-term hedonistic gratification is ethically acceptable. And I don't think it is. I think that it trains you to treat yourself and other people as instrumental objects of short-term pleasure, obviously. Mm-hmm. Well, is that how you want to train yourself? How's that going to work you're going to have a long-term relationship at some point? How are you going to train yourself for that? Okay, so having said that, and then, how carefully should we conduct ourselves in sexual matters? I would say, well, as carefully as you conduct yourself in any matter of importance. And that stretches all the way up to the top, whatever the top is. You're going to treat the other person as if they're a divine locus of consciousness or a disposable pornographic entity. Well, those are the borders. Okay, but then you say, well, you have to practice. And there's truth in that. And how do you practice? And the answer is, well, that's one of the central complications of life, right? To get the balance between individual action and the whole domain of sexuality and reproduction right is perhaps there's no more difficult question, especially once you've solved the question of, do you have enough to eat tomorrow? Mm-hmm. That would be the next one that pops up. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there is such a thing as casual sex. I think that's indistinguishable from masturbation, which I also don't regard as a particularly heroic act. And so, well,
T-shirts, masturbation, right. Not a particularly
heroic
act.
And I think people have that sense, and I don't think that that's culturally instantiated, because in some sense we've done everything we can to eradicate every last vestige of sexual shame, which I think in the final analysis is impossible, because there are all sorts of reasons for the persistence of sexual shame that have nothing to do with cultural context. And still, it's a furtive and underground activity. And the reason for that is because it's suboptimal for all sorts of reasons. Well, how much motivation does a young man need to overcome his fear of rejection and establish a relationship with a woman? And the answer to that is, we don't know. But sexual deprivation could easily be part of it. Because to do something difficult, you need a lot of motivation. You need frustration working for you. You need fear working for you. You need lust working for you. You need loneliness working for you. To bind a man and woman together, especially if they're going to produce children, this is a very, very difficult thing to do successfully. And so anything that interferes with that is to be viewed with extreme skepticism, and that's undoubtedly part of the reason that shame around hedonistic sexual activities remains a constant, despite our best attempts to eradicate it.
I think I would also say, just from my experience growing up, especially in university, it's not like it's seen on the outside, having casual sexual relationships, as this fun thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not fun.
No.
And nobody thinks it's fun, especially women. So if you're around other girls and they're like, oh yeah, I hooked up with this guy, none of you guys are actually enjoying that.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's a lie that women tell each other.
Yeah. Why?
I think because they think other people don't care. And because if you do it, it makes you feel bad enough that you're like, well, I don't want to look at that. Whatever's going on there, like maybe me feeling bad is not healthy.
Right.
Like I'm not, and
it means there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, or there's something wrong with you, right? And so it's like, and it's unpleasant enough that you're like, well, I'll just, keep going. It's already happened. There's nothing I can do about it. So it might as well be okay, because what am I going to do about it if it's not okay?
Yeah.
So and then, and I think this is pretty common for women in university to hook up with people, right? It's called hookup culture. There's Tinder, like it happens. But I like for anybody out there who's thinking maybe I don't want to do that, it's not fun. It doesn't make you feel good. It really makes you really lonely, right? It's not a good idea.
Why do you think it makes you lonely?
I think because what you're looking for is a connection with somebody. And you're getting this physical connection, and you're not getting any emotional connection. And it's
right, and then there's the contradiction.
It's
a terrible contradiction.
Yeah, and
right?
it's
here's an interesting thing I used to tell my clients is, don't do anything with anyone sexually that you wouldn't talk to them about.
Seems
like, well, I wouldn't talk to anybody about that. It's like, but you'll act it out, eh?
Yeah.
So that's worth thinking about. So you're not intimate enough with them to have a conscious discussion, but you're perfectly willing to blunder stupidly into it, and then risk the aftermath. A lot of that's fueled by alcohol too.
Yeah, like a lot of it is fueled, like all of it. Yeah. You're not going to do that.
If we ever
sober.
wanted to have a serious conversation about sexual impropriety on campuses, for example, the first thing we'd focus on is alcohol. But we don't want to have a serious conversation about that because, we don't want to have, we don't want to have chaperoned parties like there were in the 1950s. It's like, having some older people around to keep the drunken orgy under control actually turns out not to be such a bad idea.
Especially people who are non-biased, right? Are unbiased. We're just there saying, well, this doesn't look like it's going well. Maybe I'll help this person out.
Yeah, well,
instead of a group of friends, they're like, no, do it. Like,
yeah, right. Well, which is exactly
a bunch of doorknobs running into each other.
Well, that's what you get with alcohol too. Alcohol is a drug that really radically decreases people's medium to long-term orientation, right? It really focuses you on the present, which makes it, if it's a good drug for you, it makes it unbelievably fun because it decreases anxiety and it increases likely opiate bonding and dopamine-mediated extroversion. And so, like, it's cocaine, heroin, and a benzodiazepine rolled into one. And so it makes you not care. And for pure hedonism, there's nothing better than not caring.
Yeah.
But alcohol is a catastrophe on many fronts because of that. And a huge proportion of violent crimes, exploitative crimes, rapes, a huge proportion of those are conducted between drunk people. And so, but I don't believe that there is moral casual sex, because I don't think sex is casual. I don't think anything about it is casual. In the West, because we're very immature, we think that the purpose of a marriage is the happiness of the people who are involved in the marriage, the husband and the wife. And that's just not the purpose of marriage at all. The purpose is long-term facilitation of their psychological and spiritual development and the establishment of an environment that's beneficial to children. Freud was no dummy when he pointed to the fact that the devouring mother was one of the major impediments to proper human development. He knew that, looking deep into the darkest families. and seeing this proclivity of the overprotective mother to destroy the developing integrity of the child, to keep the child infantile, to cling to that relationship instead of developing a life for herself and letting the child go flourish. That's Hansel and Gretel, right? You're lost in the woods. Why? Well, your family's broken up. You have an evil stepmother. So now you're lost in the woods. What's your abuse rate if you have a step-parent? 100 times normal. So you're lost in the woods. Well, what happens? Well, you come across a gingerbread house. Well, that's pretty damn convenient. You need a house. It's more than you could even hope for. It's not just a house. It's a house made out of candy. Well, what's inside a house made out of candy? A witch who wants to fatten you up and eat you. And that's the devouring mother, and that's an old fairy tale. Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, and so, we could dwell on that for a minute too. One of the things we won't honestly discuss in our society, one of many, is the fundamental nature of female political psychopathology. And there's male political psychopathology, obviously. That's what the feminists complain about all the time when they talk about the oppressive patriarchy, toxic masculinity. There's no shortage of toxic masculinity. So is there any toxic femininity? Well, not if the feminine is just the, oppressed virgin goddess whose nature, but how about we don't live in that fantasy world? And we know, there's female political pathology, the tendency to infantilize everyone, and the tendency to assume that everyone who doesn't go along with the infantilization is properly characterized as a predator. And so, you wonder, why are the universities turning into extended daycares? Well, a lot of the reason for that is that women who don't have anything better to do are turning the university students into the infants they never had. So, yeah.
Jesus.
So, I don't know when we'll be able to be mature enough to have that conversation. 20 years from now.
What is a path to bring this back to some sort of rational, logical way of discussing these problems?
We're trying to put together something like an alternative vision of the future, say an alternative to that kind of apocalyptic narrative that's being put forward, at least implicitly, by organizations like the WEF, and that's the virginal planet, rapacious tyrant, all-devouring consumer religion. And it's more like something like, well, we want to ask people 6 key questions. Okay, so how do we get energy and resources at the lowest possible cost, as rapidly as possible, to the largest number of people around the world? That's one question. And so there's a presumption in the question, and here's one of the presumptions. You don't get to save the planet by making energy prices so expensive that no one poor can afford them. That's off the table. So if you want to develop alternative energy sources, no problem. Because, hey man, the more energy sources we have, the better. But you don't get to impose your utopian vision in the service of your narcissism on the poor. We're going to try to make the poor rich. We're going to try to alleviate absolute poverty. Pro-human view on environmental stewardship front. That's the next question. What are the major problems that are confronting us? How do we take a sophisticated, multidimensional view of that? How do we prioritize our attempts to establish our states and our international relationships properly so that we prioritize human well-being, in harmony with nature to the degree that's possible, but human-focused and not predicated on the idea that there are too many goddamn mouths on the planet to feed and that you're evil if you just think about having children. So then on the governance front, this is where it gets kind of more left-wing, I would say, is none of the people involved in this consortium so far are very thrilled with global corporate fascist government, media, and corporation collusion. And we're seeing this at the high end. It's like a Tower of Babel, is that the powerful players in the world are increasingly collaborating to impose a top-down vision of the future on everyone. And that's a future that's predicated on a zero-growth model. And the idea that, well, we'd need 5 planets, really, to support everyone at the current standard of living that obtains in the West. So the best pathway forward is to deny loans by the World Bank to developing countries so they can't develop, energy sources, which all that'll mean is they're going to burn wood and coal, obviously. So that's the third question is, how do we arrange systems of governance to stop the march of something like pathological gigantism This is why I like people like Russell Brand and also you to some degree politically, you know, because you guys are very, what would you say, sensitive to the danger of that kind of corrupt collusion, that regulatory capture that occurs when corporate entities and media entities and governmental entities are all in bed together, like the FDA and the CDC and so forth and so on without end. So that's the third question. The fourth question is, what do we put forward as a vision on the family policy front to facilitate the, what would you call it, the encouragement and the maintenance of long-term monogamous couples who are child-centered, and to make increasing the birth rate part of that policy, to put policies in place that would support long-term stable monogamous families, two-parent families, and child-centered. You know, because in the West, because we're very immature, we think that the purpose of a marriage is the happiness of the people who are involved in the marriage, the husband and the wife. And that's just not the purpose of marriage at all. The purpose is long-term facilitation of their psychological and spiritual development and the establishment of an environment that's beneficial to children. That's a responsible way of thinking about it. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what that means. And, you know, it's tricky because, like, I think the ideal has to be long-term committed monogamous heterosexual relationships. And I had a big conversation about this with Dave Rubin. You know, Rubin's gay and he's married, and him and his partner now have 2 infants, and we talked through how that was. It was a very hard thing for them to arrange, obviously. Why? Well, they're both male. So that poses a severe problem on the reproductive front, right? And so they managed that. They have 2 infants, but it's very complex, and it's obviously not a solution to the problem of relationship and reproduction that's duplicatable across large numbers of people. It just takes too many resources. Now, I do think we have to have an ideal at the center of every concept, but the ideal can't be too rigid, you know, because people aren't perfect. You know, in my own family, there's lots of people who are divorced. In lots of people's families, there are people who are gay. You know, there are lots of people in unhappy marriages. Nobody attains the ideal. So the ideal has to be surrounded by a fringe of tolerance, but that doesn't mean you sacrifice the ideal. And the ideal has to be, well, we know there's a literature on fatherlessness. You know, it's a bloody catastrophe.
The data is in. The experiment is done. Tens of thousands of people, multiple countries. And it's not what anyone expected. And you might think, well, it's all the right-wing psychologists. It's like, all the right-wing psychologists are in this room, sitting in this chair. Is that sufficient?
But you sort of do have certain predispositions that you're giving in the same way in which people from political correctness are trying to say this is what it means to be a woman, these are the kind of things that it is expected from a woman to do to defend herself. And it seems to me that you are making a similar claim about this is what conservative people do, and this is how they always relate to hierarchy.
Well, I would say that I perhaps am doing that, but I don't see how that's the same as what the postmodernists are doing. I mean, as far as I can tell, the postmodernists aren't saying that the groups, the individuals within those groups, are characterized by any stable characteristics whatsoever, except for the fact of their comparative oppression. So I don't understand the first part of your argument. I mean, part of the reason the postmodern types have been going after me is because I've dared to say that men and women differ in temperament, which, by the way, they do. So, now, you know, that's actually something that might be worth just differentiating quickly, because it's actually technically somewhat challenging, but also very much worth knowing. I was debating someone on a panel this morning on a TV show, The Right Stuff. And this was a woman who led the Women's Equality Party. And she cited some psychological literature that purported to claim that men and women were mostly the same. And that's actually true. We are more the same than different. If you look at our temperaments, there's more overlap than there is variance by a substantial amount. And so even on the temperamental dimensions where there is most difference between men and women, the difference isn't of massive magnitude at the center of the distribution. So for example, women are less aggressive than men, which is, by the way, why they try to commit suicide more often, but are much less lethal in their actions. That's one example, but there are many examples. If you draw a random woman and a random man out of the population, the probability that the man will be more aggressive is 60%. If you bet on the man, you'd win 60% of the time. That's not a walloping difference. It's not 95% of the time. You know, it's a difference that is substantive, it's significant, it's measurable, but it's not large by the standards by which such things are judged. But that's not the point. The point is that most of the activity takes place at the extremes. So out on the tails of the distribution. So here's an example. About 9 out of 10 people in prison are male. Why? Because to be in prison, you have to be the most aggressive person, let's say in 100. Okay, those differences at the midpoint are large enough so that if you go out to the extremes, 1 in 100 people, you have an overwhelming preponderance of men. And so you can have your cake and eat it too. You can say, well, yeah, broadly speaking, men and women are more the same than different. The overlap is greater than the disjunction. But that's not relevant if what's being selected is often at the extremes, and it often is. So for example, with regards to engineering, there's a fair bit of evidence that people who are more interested in things than in people become engineers. Now, that's not really going to be, what is that, shocking? Are you shocked by that? You shouldn't be shocked by that, right? You can tell that not only by what engineers do, but you can tell that by how they think, and you can tell that just by talking to them, if you know a bunch of engineers. So, and it turns out that the largest temperamental difference that's known between men and women is actually interest in people versus interest in things. And so it has nothing to do with competence, but it has a lot to do with interest. And because you have to be very interested in things to go be an engineer, because that's all you're going to be doing if you're an engineer, then only those people who are extremely interested in things tend to become engineers. And most of them are men. And that's why even in places like Scandinavia, where a tremendous amount of effort has been put into flattening the sociocultural landscape, and successfully, by the way, there's still a preponderance of male engineers. And there's a preponderance of female nurses. And no matter how much sociological gerrymandering goes on, those statistics have remained quite intractable over about a 15-year period. And so there are differences. They're not massive. And then you might ask, well, are those sociocultural or biological? It's like, well, that's a hard question to answer, because it depends on how much variability there is in the sociocultural landscape, because the proportion by which something is biological versus sociocultural varies with the sociocultural landscape. That's a complicated thing to digest, because you think of those things as fixed, but they're not. So, but what we have demonstrated quite clearly, and this is mainstream science, despite the fact that people don't like it, this test has already been done. So we developed a personality model that's pretty stable across cultures, purely derived from statistical processes, an atheoretical model if there ever was one, and quite an unattractive model because of that conceptually, but that's beside the point. Then we saw cross-culturally whether there were differences in the fundamental temperaments of men and women, and the answer was yes, cross-culturally, quite robust. Women are higher in the experience of anxiety and emotional pain, and they're more compassionate and agreeable. Those are the big differences, and they're differences of a magnitude that I already pointed out. Then the next question is, well, to what degree is that biological versus sociocultural? And it's complicated because that variable depends on the sociocultural landscape, but we'll put that aside. You can determine that by stacking up countries from those who have done everything they possibly can to flatten out the sociocultural landscape in relationship to gender, to those who haven't, that are still very stratified by sex. And then what you do is you look at the magnitude of the temperament differences in keeping with the variability that those countries have in terms of their sociocultural egalitarianism. And the sociocultural types, the social constructionists, their prediction is, as cultures become more egalitarian, men and women become more different, more the same, because it's environmental. That isn't what happens. Exactly the opposite happens. As you flatten out the sociocultural landscape, men and women become more different. The data is in, the experiment is done. Tens of thousands of people, multiple countries. And it's not what anyone expected. And you might think, well, it's all the right-wing psychologists. It's like, all the right-wing psychologists are in this room, sitting in this chair.